I'm about to play an audio clip, but before that, I ask you to please close your eyes and just listen.
Terrorists, jihadists, violent,
Muslim
ISIS
terrorist
lover,
bombs,
cockroach,
young
oppressors,
Muslim boy building
terrorists,
bombs in school.
jihadists,
Your Allah
It must
violent,
not be allowed in this
ISIS
country.
lover,
for
people are
cockroach,
terrorists,
oppressors,
killers,
terrorists,
awful, female
jihadists,
mutilation,
violent,
anti-gay,
ISIS lover,
anti-women, anti-whatever,
cockroach,
ISIS,
oppressors,
motherfuckers, get out of
terrorists,
my country,
jihadists,
trash,
violent,
worthless piece of Muslim
ISIS
trash.
lover,
You all need to go
cockroach,
back to where you came
oppressors.
from. The only good Muslim is a dead Muslim.
That piece was made by putting together zikr tasbih, or the repetition of a word giving thanks to God, with layers of some of the hate that my Muslim sisters and I have come across online. That last line is probably the most shocking. No, the only good Muslim is a dead Muslim. But even before we can begin to think about what that means, let's just pause for a moment. Who or what is a Muslim? Let me tell you about some of the Muslims that I know. I know Muslims that come from a culture where almost the entire population is addicted to a plant substance. They mix this with a thick liquid made from the secretion of an animal. Alongside this, many of them ingest a food made from grass seeds, almost burnt near a flame, and then smeared with a layer of fat. They speak openly about this addiction, apparently without shame. Bizarre, right? In what culture could this possibly be socially acceptable? Now, what if I were to tell you that this is, in fact, just the very Canadian ritual of picking up a cup of coffee and a bagel from Tim Hortons every morning? This is what happens when we misconstrue facts. We take something that is so ordinary and we turn it into something so distant, something that is everything that we aren't. This example was taken from the red card, but this is what happens to Muslims in media every single day. And by media, I don't just mean news. I mean movies, TV shows, books, literature, theater, and much more. All of these things tend to paint Islam as something tangible and something out there. I'm sure we've all seen our news feeds flooded with content about Muslim terrorists or veiled Muslim women. But for all of this media attention, let's just put into perspective for a second. What percent of the Canadian population do you think is actually Muslim? 15%? 10%? 5%? 3% of the Canadian population is Muslim. But for such a tiny segment of the population, Muslims are always overrepresented in the media when something goes wrong. And that too, always as members of a whole. Perpetrators who are Muslim are never afforded the descriptors lone wolf or mentally ill, as many other non-Muslim terrorists are. All of this biased and unnecessary media attention, why does this happen? I can't begin to think of all of the reasons, but I can think of one. And it's because people are so afraid of what they don't know. I did a quick Google search with the terms, "Does Islam?" and this is what came up. It's the 5 in red in particular that I would like to highlight, because the construction of these statements is so much a part of the reason why misinformation is continually being perpetuated about Islam. And it's something that we can correct now. Islam does not believe in reincarnation. Islam does not eat shawarma every second Thursday of the month for lunch. Islam does not say to oppress women or to love your neighbor, because Islam cannot talk. When we paint a religion as a thinking, talking, demanding singular entity, then we erase the multitudes of different perspectives that exist. When we do this, we make it easy to sell Islam as an inherently good or an inherently bad thing. Furthermore, when we do this, we forget that each act of interpretation, translation, submission, action, all of these are done by people. Religion and faith are not static, unchanging rituals that have been sent down from above. They are connections, processes, questions that are reimagined and reinterpreted by each individual every day. When we say Islam says X or Islam says Y, we take away all of the agency that people have to interpret things themselves. And furthermore, even if Islam could speak, who's to say that it would be this demanding, yelling, authoritative figure that the media paints? Why couldn't Islam be a gentle spirit that sings Quran as a devotional melody, that recites poetry of the great saints, or that dances itself through the breaths of each of its followers? Typically, when people learn about Islam, they learn that Islam comes from the root word meaning submission or peace. They learn about the 5 pillars, and sometimes, if you're lucky, they learn about the lunar calendar. But my Islam is much more badass than that. My Islam is not a linear pattern of rules and obligations. My Islam is a constant conversation with the divine, with poets, teachers, friends, children, and nature. My faith is sometimes the whispered requests of the great sages to fight for justice, and other times the angry commands in devotional literature to examine my own ego. My Islam is the laughter of a toddler. It's the quivering notes of a qawwali, and it is a love that cannot be contained in the heavens or the earth. My faith is a promise of joy, of protection, and of a love so strong that no mountain, no river, no desert could ever come between. In Canada, we have concocted this notion that Islamophobia is predominantly an American phenomenon. That Canadians, as multicultural and as accepting as we are, cannot possibly harbor hate towards another. This is blatantly false. A few months ago, our country mourned the heartless and senseless loss of 4 members in a Muslim family in London, Ontario. Fayez Afzal was the only survivor of the attack, but he lost his mother, his father, his sister, and his grandmother. He was 9 years old. 9 years old is old enough to still cry over a paper cut. 9 years old is old enough to still believe in the tooth fairy. 9 years old is not old enough to wake up in a hospital bed with your family ripped from your life. It is not old enough to wonder how just because you are Muslim, someone can hate you and your family so much. Enough to kill. Hate and fear do not exist in vacuums. They exist in places where they have room to grow, fueled by intolerance and nurtured by ignorance. What happened in London was not an isolated attack. Canada has the highest rate of murders perpetrated against Muslims than any other G7 country. Yesterday marked 5 years since the Quebec City mosque shootings, in which a gunman entered a mosque, killed 6 innocent people, and injured 19 others. Prior to this terrorist had spent significant time on social media and other websites promoting Islamophobia, hatred and the mass murder of Muslims, xenophobia, and other sorts of hatred. I can't begin to imagine, I can't help but think that if the narratives that were put out into the world about Islam were different, those 6 people, among so many others, might still be alive today. The words we use and the stories we tell hold power. Dominic Collinson said in his TED Talk that as soon as a story leaves the lips of the teller, it exists in the imagination of the teller, but of each listener. In this way, as our stories grow and are told, they gain momentum. Much of the momentum that surrounds narratives of Islam today is not something that inspires creativity and thought and wonder. But we can work to reverse those narratives, and we can work to stand up against Islamophobia. But what if we could do more than that? What if we could stand up for Islam? I have 3 suggestions as to how we can do this. Pronunciation, examination, and speaking. P-E-S. Peace, if you will. Number 1, pronunciation. Many Arabic Muslim names, such as Akbar, Rahima, Jamila, Kareem, are all derived from the 99 names of God in Islam. And parents choose these names for their children with the intention of manifesting that quality in their children. Kareem, for example, means generous. So, this means that when we don't take the time to learn to pronounce someone's name properly, or at least don't meaningfully try, we aren't just being rude. We are being disrespectful to a tradition that spans back generations. Furthermore, the terms Islam and Muslim are not pronounced Islam and Muslim. And so if we can pronounce them properly and deliberately continue to say them wrong, this again isn't just being rude. It is an intentional display of disrespect. 2, examine how you know what you know about Islam. I recently realized this, but for many of my non-Muslim friends, much of their exposure to Islam comes from American TV shows, American media, and other forms. And for some people, Aladdin was their first, if not only, exposure to Islamic culture. Much of this content isn't created by Muslims, and it tends to use the tropes of the oppressed, veiled Muslim woman, or the violent, angry Muslim terrorist. Islamic kit culture is much more than that. It's rich with poetry, music, dance, singing, recitation, and celebration. But because these aren't the narratives that are dominant in our society, it becomes our responsibility to go and seek them out and learn to appreciate the beauty in them. Content made by Muslims about Islam deserves to be at the forefront of our knowledge about this faith. Finally, number 3, stand up and speak out. We've all seen what happens when people who are driven by ignorance resort to violence. But sometimes just a simple conversation can be enough to reverse some of these negative stereotypes associated with Islam. One of my favorite lines of a Qawwali says, "Aql hai teri sipar, ishq shamshir teri," meaning, intellect is your shield and love is your sword. These are the tools that we must use in our fight to build a more just society. And it is with these tools that we can gain the courage to stand up against Islamophobia and for Islam. Thank you.